Hello. General Hospital today will reveal. Exciting events are expected next week, from January 26th to 30th, 2025. First, Sonny Corinthos had always thrived in chaos, but what made him truly dangerous was his ability to manipulate order just as effectively. In this chapter of his tangled legacy, Sonny saw an opportunity to use Ava Jerome, not as an ally, nor even as an adversary, but as a chess piece. His strategy was deceptively elegant to exploit the emotional storm brewing between Ava, Sidwell, and Lucy Coe. What looked like a love triangle to outsiders was, to Sonny, a carefully drawn map of vulnerabilities. Each of them carried a secret desire or insecurity that could be weaponized. He didn't need to break them, just tilt their balance ever so slightly. Ava, already teetering between guilt and temptation, became the center of this psychological operation. Sonny didn't act out of jealousy or rage. His intentions were colder, rooted in control and leverage, and Ava never saw the web tightening around her until it was too late to step back. Ava, for her part, was drawn to Sidwell in a way that frightened her. He was ambitious and unpredictable, and in many ways reminded her of a younger version of Sonny, one still capable of fire rather than calculation. But there was something about Lucy that made everything more complicated. Lucy had the gift of disarming people with charm. But Ava wasn't fooled. She sensed that Lucy's interest in Sidwell wasn't merely personal, and that scared her. Instead of confronting it, she began drifting emotionally, withdrawing into herself while still playing the game. Sonny's manipulations exploited this hesitance. He began planting seeds of doubt, using subtle gestures, strategically timed conversations, and even silence, all designed to make Ava question her instincts. He didn't need her to trust him just to stop trusting herself. Meanwhile, Jason Morgan had been trying to rebuild something resembling a normal life after so many years in the shadows. Britt Westburn had become a rare source of light for him, someone with whom he could imagine something resembling hope. Yet that hope began to dim, and Jason could feel it before he could explain it. Britt wasn't pulling away physically, if anything. She was still present, attentive in the obvious ways. But something had shifted. Her energy was off. Her laughter carried hesitation. Her touch lingered less. It wasn't rejection, not quite. It was more like a silent scream buried beneath a smile. And Jason's instincts, sharpened over decades, sounded alarms he couldn't ignore. Britt's distance was not rooted in disinterest, but fear. She had been fighting a battle of her own. One she believed Jason wouldn't understand, or perhaps wouldn't survive if he got too close. Her own medical past, her dark family history, and the resurgence of secrets she thought were buried, these weighed on her like anchors. Instead of trusting Jason with them, she decided to shield him, even if it meant fracturing their bond. To Britt, protecting Jason meant pushing him away, even if it hurt them both. But in doing so, she underestimated how deeply Jason was connected to her, not just emotionally, but intuitively. He didn't need a confession. Her silence told him everything he needed to know. Danger was near. As Jason started to quietly investigate, not through surveillance or violence, but through carefully observing Britt's patterns and behaviors, he discovered traces of her old contacts resurfacing. Medical records she had sealed. Conversations cut short when he entered the room. He realized that whatever Britt was hiding, it was something she feared would destroy not just her relationship with him, but perhaps her sense of identity. And Jason, ever the protector, now found himself in an impossible place, unable to confront her without pushing her further, yet terrified of what he might discover if he waited too long. Back in Sonny's world, the dynamics between Sidwell and Lucy were beginning to unravel. Sonny had orchestrated just enough tension, little gestures that implied betrayal, twisted truths offered at just the right moment. Sidwell, already suspicious by nature, began to view Lucy not as a partner, but as a potential liability. Lucy, in turn, felt the air change and knew something was off, but couldn't prove it. Sonny stayed in the background, never directly intervening, but always nearby like smoke before a fire. His mastery wasn't in what he said, but in what he allowed others to believe about themselves and each other. Ava, caught in the crossfire, began to sense the manipulation, but by then the damage was done. Her emotions had been tampered with too many times, and she no longer trusted her own reactions. She began spiraling, questioning if she had ever been in control. Her connection to Sidwell now felt like an illusion, something Sonny had constructed only to rip away. She didn't confront Sonny, she couldn't. Instead, she started retreating from both Sidwell and Lucy, believing that distance was the only protection she had left. But isolation was exactly what Sonny needed her to choose. Alone, she was malleable. Surrounded, she was a threat. Jason, meanwhile, became consumed by a growing sense of dread. He didn't share it with anyone. Not Carly, not Sam, not even Spinelli. This was personal. Britt wasn't just another woman in trouble, she was someone he had begun to anchor himself to. As he dug deeper, he began connecting dots that led to older WSB files, cryptic medical trials, and a name that had long haunted him, Caesar Faison. It couldn't be. But if Britt was once again tangled in the legacy of her father, Jason knew time was running out. He didn't care what it cost, he was going to pull her out, even if she resisted. And through it all, Sonny watched quietly, knowing exactly what he had set into motion. He didn't need to fight Jason, he just needed to keep him distracted. And if Britt's silence was enough to send Jason down a different path, away from Sonny's own operations and deeper into a maze of emotional uncertainty, then all the better. The true battle hadn't even begun, but the stage was already set. Manipulation had always been Sonny's art form, and this time, he was painting on a much larger canvas, one that included not just enemies, but former friends and fractured hearts. Second, Ross Cullum, the newly appointed director of the WSB, had already begun reshaping operations from the inside, with a precise understanding of how emotional entanglements often compromise loyalty. Ross anticipated Britt Westburn's next move with disturbing accuracy. He knew she was emotionally tethered to Jason Morgan in ways that made her vulnerable, and that her growing anxiety about her past would drive her to seek isolation. Windermere, dark, remote, and familiar, was the logical place for her retreat. Ross suspected she would vanish into the estate's shadowy halls, not to hide from the world, but to immerse herself in a research project far more dangerous than anyone understood. The deeper truth was that this project had ramifications that reached far beyond medical science, tying into WSB secrets that Ross was determined to keep buried. As Britt began withdrawing from Port Charles, her disappearance didn't go unnoticed. Jason, who had already sensed something was wrong, became more alert when her messages became sporadic and her location data abruptly went dark. He knew her well enough to recognize that this wasn't a casual retreat. Her emotional shifts were too sharp, her distance too rehearsed. Jason had spent a lifetime reading between the lines, and Britt's sudden silence sounded like a warning rather than a choice. Windermere, with all its twisted corridors and ghosted memories, immediately rose to the top of his list. He didn't need proof, he only needed the gut-deep certainty that someone he cared about was in trouble. That had always been enough to send him into the fire. Meanwhile, Ross Cullum kept watch. Though he hadn't directly ordered surveillance on Jason, he'd made it clear to his inner circle that Morgan's movements needed monitoring. Jason had a habit of disrupting WSB operations, especially when it involved people he loved. Ross believed that Britt's loyalty was already a liability, and that Jason's determination could unravel the carefully woven containment strategy the WSB had in place. What worried Ross most, however, wasn't just Jason's ability to locate Britt, it was what Jason might discover if he did. There were files in Windermere, encrypted research, black market clinical trials, and references to a former WSB defector that Ross needed to stay hidden. If Jason uncovered those truths, it would shake not just his faith in Britt, but his understanding of what the WSB had been willing to do to silence threats. At the same time, Jocelyn Jacks was dealing with a crisis of her own. Her usual support system, Carly, Trina, Dex, had grown more fragmented as secrets tore through their lives. Jocelyn found herself emotionally unmoored, unsure of who to trust or where to turn. She needed guidance, clarity, and a sense of agency. But the people around her were consumed by their own battles. And so, in a surprising twist, she reached out to someone she once viewed as a peripheral figure, someone she had judged too harshly in the past. It was an act of desperation at first, but it became something else, an instinctual pull toward someone who understood shadows, because they had lived in them. The person she turned to wasn't a friend or even a confidant, it was someone who had once stood on the edge of her world like a warning. But desperation has a way of reshaping boundaries. As they began to talk, Jocelyn discovered an unexpected ally, someone who didn't offer empty reassurance, but instead spoke with unfiltered honesty and emotional discipline. She was drawn to the clarity, to the sense that this person didn't see her as fragile or naive, but as someone capable of facing hard truths. It gave her a strength she hadn't realized she was craving, and it planted the seed of a new alliance that could become transformative. This alliance didn't begin with trust, it began with curiosity, and perhaps a shared sense of being underestimated. Jocelyn, having inherited both Carly's fire and Jax's resilience, recognized something in her unlikely partner, a mirror of her own internal conflict. As they spent more time together, boundaries blurred. The pain she carried about Dex, about her fractured friendships, about her own identity slowly began to surface, and instead of being dismissed or pitied, she was met with calm understanding. That sense of being seen without judgment made Jocelyn begin to rethink not just her alliances, but her role in the broader war that was consuming Port Charles. Back in Windermere, Britt worked obsessively, believing that if she could just complete this one phase of her project, everything would make sense again. But the castle's oppressive silence, the ghost of her father's legacy, and the creeping paranoia that she was being watched began to corrode her focus. She didn't know that Jason was closing in, or that Ross Cullum had already laid contingencies in place in case she crossed the wrong line. Britt believed she could still control the narrative. What she didn't realize was that she had already become a pawn in someone else's much larger, darker endgame. And that game was about to pull everyone, Jason, Jocelyn, Sonny, even Ava, into a vortex of betrayal and revelation none of them were ready for. In the end, as Jason stepped onto Spoon Island, every instinct screamed that time was running out. The winds howled off the water with a kind of fury that felt personal, and Windermere loomed like a judgment. Jason didn't know if Britt would welcome him or shut him out. He didn't know what secret she was harboring or if he was too late to stop whatever she had set in motion. But none of that mattered. Jason had made his choice. He was going to find her because that was who he was. And if Ross Cullum thought he could use people like weapons and hide behind the WSB's veil, he was about to be reminded what happened when Jason Morgan went to war. Third, Curtis Ashford had been navigating months of emotional upheaval, personal disappointment, and moral ambiguity. But in a rare moment of reprieve, a wave of relief swept over him, something subtle but undeniable. It wasn't just about escaping from recent chaos or surviving another public scandal. It was the glimmer of hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in weeks. That relief, quiet and introspective, was rooted in the cautious optimism he had for Portia Robinson's future. Though their romantic entanglement remained complicated and layered with resentment, guilt, and unspoken affection, Curtis still cared deeply about her professional standing. Watching her suffer, stripped of her position at General Hospital, had taken a toll on both of them. Now, for the first time in a while, it seemed there was a way back for her and perhaps, in time, for both of them. Portia's journey back to GH had been anything but linear. Once a respected doctor with an unshakable moral compass, she had found herself at the center of medical and ethical scrutiny that threatened not only her career but her identity. Her decisions, flawed, emotional, and human, had come under a microscope, and while some argued she deserved the fallout, others saw her as a scapegoat for a larger institutional failure. For Portia, returning to the hospital under probation wasn't a mark of shame, it was a lifeline. She would have to work under strict supervision, prove her competence all over again, and face the judgment of peers who once admired her. But in many ways, that was the best outcome she could hope for, and deep down, she knew it. Redemption wouldn't come in grand gestures, it would come in the quiet diligence of day-to-day work, in showing up when no one expected her to. Curtis, though no longer romantically entangled with Portia in the way they once were, couldn't help but feel pride at the thought of her return. He had always admired her strength, her brilliance, and her devotion to her patients. Even when betrayal clouded their personal relationship, he never doubted her ability as a physician. Her possible reinstatement marked a turning point not just for her but for him too. In a life that had become dominated by secrecy, surveillance, and impossible moral choices, the idea that someone could come back from the edge gave Curtis something he hadn't had in a long time: faith. It reminded him that mistakes didn't have to define people forever, that perhaps, in some deeply buried part of his heart, he might find his own path to peace. But Curtis's relief wasn't solely about Portia. Another shadow had lifted, a more immediate and dangerous one. Drew Kane's stroke had taken the town by surprise. Once a threat, Drew had become immobile, silenced by a medical event that removed him at least temporarily from the board. Curtis would never say it aloud, but part of his calm came from knowing that Drew could no longer manipulate, scheme, or lash out at those who had crossed him. While he wasn't celebrating another man's suffering, Curtis couldn't ignore the fact that Drew's incapacitation removed a significant danger from the lives of those he cared about. It was a bitter kind of justice and asked for, but not entirely unwelcome. Drew's downward spiral had become a ticking time bomb in Port Charles. Once viewed as a hero, his descent into erratic behavior, manipulation, and cold-hearted tactics had left a trail of emotional casualties, Curtis among them. The rivalry had turned personal, spilling into realms far beyond business or politics. Curtis had warned people, had tried to expose the patterns, but Drew's charisma often shielded him. Only now, as the hospital bedsheets tucked around Drew's limp form, were people beginning to admit what they had refused to see. Drew had become a threat, and though Curtis didn't wish harm on anyone, he allowed himself one small exhale of relief. For now, at least, the danger was paused. Still, Curtis knew better than to believe peace ever lasted in Port Charles. Wounds could scab, but they rarely healed cleanly. He wondered what Drew's next move might be if he recovered. Would he double down on his crusade for vengeance, or would the stroke force a reckoning, a reevaluation of who he had become? Curtis wasn't naive enough to hope for a complete transformation, but there was something sobering about mortality. Maybe Drew, finally forced to confront his own fragility, would emerge changed, or maybe he would return more dangerous than ever. That uncertainty weighed on Curtis, tempering his relief with cautious realism. Meanwhile, Portia's reinstatement under probation came with strings attached. Every decision she made would be scrutinized, every procedure double-checked, and yet she embraced the terms. The alternative had been a complete professional erasure. With her return came the opportunity not just to rebuild, but to reclaim the narrative that had been stolen from her. Patients would slowly learn to trust her again, and staff would eventually judge her not by the rumors or accusations, but by her actions. She would have to walk that path alone in many ways, but the quiet support of people like Curtis reminded her she wasn't entirely abandoned. For Curtis, watching Portia prepare to return to work at GH stirred a complicated mix of emotions. There was admiration, certainly, but also grief. Grief for the life they once imagined together, for the closeness they had lost, and for the betrayal that had ruptured something sacred between them. Yet there was also growth. Pain had a way of shaping people, of forcing them to see themselves stripped of illusion. Curtis was learning to make peace with the gray areas, the moments where love and hurt coexisted, where betrayal didn't erase loyalty, and where relief could live alongside quiet sorrow. In this fragile equilibrium, Curtis found his next step, not a resolution, but a beginning. Fourth, Willow had long perfected the art of appearing fragile, of cloaking herself in sorrow so convincingly that even those closest to her couldn't see the cracks in her performance. To the world, she was a woman broken by tragedy, devastated by Drew's sudden collapse, tormented by guilt and helplessness. But beneath that carefully composed exterior was something far colder, a chilling awareness that it was her actions, her deception, and her manipulation that had pushed Drew over the edge. The stroke may have been unexpected, but the path to it had been paved with secrets, denial, and a quiet ruthlessness that Willow never admitted to, not even to herself. She wore her grief like a mask, not as a means of self-punishment, but as a way to maintain control over the narrative she was determined to preserve. The people around her responded exactly as she hoped. They rallied, comforted, and sympathized, never questioning the depth of her pain. Among them was Harrison Chase, who had always harbored a quiet protectiveness over Willow. Despite everything that had passed between them, Chase had his own burdens, his complicated dynamic with Brooke Lynn, his ever-present sense of duty, but even so, he couldn't ignore the sight of Willow unraveling. Eventually, he would reach out, his instincts compelling him to offer solace. He would sit beside her, speak in soft tones, and try to remind her of her strength. But what Chase would never realize is that Willow didn't need rescuing. She needed validation. And his concern, though sincere, would only serve to strengthen the illusion she had constructed. Meanwhile, Jordan Ashford had her own crisis management to tend to. A seasoned strategist with a sharp sense for political maneuvering, Jordan saw Drew's incapacitation not only as a personal tragedy, but as a critical juncture for the power structure in Port Charles. With Drew temporarily out of commission, a vacuum had opened, and vacuums rarely stayed empty for long. Jordan understood the stakes. Whoever stepped into Drew's shoes wouldn't just inherit a title. They would inherit influence, connections, and the ability to shape policy that extended far beyond city limits. It was in this context that Jordan began arranging a private meeting, one that would bypass public scrutiny and focus entirely on what came next. The name that surfaced quickly and confidently was Sidwell. Already a figure of growing influence, Sidwell had positioned himself as a quiet storm, calculated, ambitious, and deeply aware of the chessboard laid out before him. With Drew sidelined, Sidwell wasted no time. He didn't wait for public approval or formal endorsement. He moved behind closed doors, aligning himself with decision-makers, making promises he might never keep, and preparing his ascent. He knew that speed was power. The longer the seat remained empty, the more crowded the field would become. So Sidwell acted swiftly, leaning on Jordan's pragmatism and her desire to avoid further chaos within the city's political landscape. Jordan, for her part, wasn't easily swayed. She understood the weight of what Sidwell proposed, not just filling Drew's seat, but effectively rewriting the rules of succession in the wake of a health crisis. And while she respected the urgency, she also recognized the risk. Sidwell's reputation was complex. Charismatic, yes, but also unpredictable. His ties to corporate players, and rumors of his connections to figures like Lucy Coe and Ava Jerome, raised legitimate concerns. But Jordan wasn't in the business of purity. She was in the business of control. If she could leverage Sidwell's ambition to restore order and secure her own alliances, she would consider it a necessary trade-off. As Sidwell began making calls, locking down donors, and shaping the optics of his campaign, others in town began to feel the ripple effects. Drew's allies were left scrambling, uncertain whether to wait for his recovery or throw their weight behind someone new. Jason, if aware of the unfolding drama, remained silent for now, but it was only a matter of time before he would step in, especially if he sensed that Britt's situation or Drew's legacy was being exploited. And Willow, watching all of this unfold from a distance, remained quiet. She had already caused the fall of one man. Now she would watch another rise in his place. Willow's silence was strategic. The less she said, the more people assumed she was grieving. That assumption granted her freedom to observe, to manipulate, to maintain her image. She allowed herself moments of rehearsed emotion when the timing called for it, but privately, she focused on ensuring no loose ends remained. Drew's stroke had neutralized a threat, but it had also left behind questions. If anyone began digging, they might uncover truths she wasn't ready to face. So, she doubled down on her performance, relying on sympathy as both armor and weapon. No one suspected the depth of her calculation. No one dared question her sorrow. And so, as the balance of power in Port Charles began to shift, the players moved accordingly. Curtis Ashford watched from a distance, wondering what role he might play in this new era. Jordan played the long game, calculating who to support and when. Sidwell tightened his grip, determined to ascend before Drew could recover and reclaim his seat. And Willow, the catalyst of it all, remained untouched, still cast in the light of morning, even as she quietly dictated the course of events behind the curtain. Finally, as Sidwell began consolidating political power in the aftermath of Drew's stroke, a separate but equally dangerous storm was brewing beneath the surface, one far more personal and psychologically devastating. While Sidwell maneuvered through strategy and ambition, Emma found herself pulled into an entirely different mission, a rescue operation that promised answers but threatened to destroy what remained of her emotional resilience. Drawn by a desperate need to uncover the truth about Anna Devane's sudden disappearance, Emma, along with Mac and Felicia Scorpio, began piecing together clues that led them to believe Anna might still be alive. For Emma, it wasn't just about duty or family loyalty, it was about saving the one person who had been her anchor, her mentor, and in many ways, her second mother. But what started as a hopeful mission would soon take a dark and damaging turn. Emma's determination was fueled by equal parts fear and love. The trail they followed was vague, but laced with familiar signs that only someone close to Anna would recognize. Every step deeper into the mystery felt both promising and haunting, as if they were being allowed just enough truth to keep them moving forward, but not enough to escape. Mac and Felicia tried to shield Emma as best they could, but she was no longer a child. The choices she made were her own, and she was willing to risk everything to bring Anna back. Unfortunately, what none of them realized was that they were being led not by Anna, but by Ross Cullum, whose ability to manipulate perception had already proven lethal. The trail was a trap, baited with emotional cues and false hope. Cullum knew exactly how to exploit their desperation. What made Cullum's deception so devastating was not just the possibility that he had taken Anna, it was that he might have faked her death entirely. The Scorpio trio soon encountered evidence so convincing, so precisely staged, that even the most skeptical among them began to question whether Anna had truly survived. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. Cullum didn't need to harm Anna directly to break those who loved her. He only needed to plant the seed of finality and let their grief take root. For Emma, this emotional ambush became unbearable. Her belief in justice, in rescue, in second chances, all of it began to crumble. The mission that once gave her purpose had become a source of trauma. She had faced danger before, but never this kind of hopelessness. Never this brand of despair that whispered the people she loved could vanish without closure or consequence. And while Port Charles turned its attention to Sidwell's political rise, the emotional fallout from Cullum's manipulation was quietly unraveling its strongest protectors. Emma's spirit, once bright with conviction, now flickered with doubt and disillusionment. Mac and Felicia, seasoned and composed, were left to pick up the emotional pieces while hiding their own anguish. They couldn't afford to crumble, not while Sidwell tightened his grip, not while the WSB's shadow loomed larger with each passing day. The layers of misdirection, trauma, and betrayal had only begun to unfold, and with every wrong turn, the realization grew more chilling. If Cullum could fabricate Anna's death once, he could erase anyone, and the search for truth was becoming more dangerous than the lies designed to bury it.